We can think back to the violent actions of January 6th. Think about the contrast between an arrest of 3 faith leaders for praying inside the Capitol Rotunda versus no arrest in the immediate aftermath of a violent attack on the Capitol, and ask ourselves some questions about, that inconsistency, I guess.
Welcome to The Stakes. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today, I'm talking to President and CEO of the Kettering Foundation, Sharon L. Davies. Sharon, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Yesterday, on April 28th, Kettering Senior Fellow Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, professor and founding director of the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy at Yale Divinity School, was arrested by Capitol Police in the rotunda of the Capitol. Dr. Barber had come to the Capitol as a part of the inaugural Moral Mondays in our nation's capital, and he was on a mission to deliver a report about the impacts of the proposed budget cuts on the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. He and other clergy were arrested and detained in dramatic fashion. Sharon, what do you make of what happened yesterday?
Well, if I understand the intentions of Reverend Barber and 2 other faith leaders who were arrested alongside him, is that he believes that it's important to interject moral questions into public conversations in the public sphere, and that we don't do that enough. And so as a part of his intention to bring that Moral Mondays movement to the nation's capital, after having it be so successful in the state of North Carolina, his goal is to raise moral questions about the actions of our government. So I have a lot of thoughts about a citizen being arrested, a faith leader in particular being arrested when that's their intention. We can think back to the violent actions of January 6, 2021, and think about the contrast between an arrest of 3 faith leaders for praying inside the Capitol Rotunda versus no arrest taking place in the immediate aftermath of a violent attack on the Capitol. And ask ourselves some questions about, that inconsistency, I guess. So that's one thing. Another is to think really hard about what it is that Reverend Barber and those other faith leaders are attempting to do right now, and especially at a moment where we may be looking at a burgeoning new era of grassroots citizen-led movement making. And so I'm interested in that because that's the sign of a healthy democracy, actually. When citizens have the freedom to bring their criticism of government action to the government representatives of us themselves. And so those are some of my at least preliminary thoughts about what he was attempting to do.
I can't help but think about really the courage that it takes for someone to choose to be a focal point of a movement and to engage in activity that may well place them in the center. Dr. Barber is a national and global leader, but it's also a courage to step forward that like ordinary people may well be called upon. I know you think a lot about courage in these times. I've heard you talk about it. Could you reflect just a little bit on like the courage that we need to see right now?
Yeah, I think this is a great example of it, actually. And we got used to, during the civil rights era in American history, seeing faith leaders lead important conversations and to push for rights and justice and fairness. But we're we haven't seen a lot of that in recent decades. It may be that we are moving into a new era of that kind of faith leadership, and it does take courage. Actually, liberty, the freedom of expression, the freedom of religion, the freedom to bring grievances to the attention of our government is at the heart of democracy. And and Justice Brandeis once said about liberty, that kind of freedom, that courage is the key to liberty. It actually takes courage to stand up for one's own freedoms that are protected by law and by our Constitution, really. And so even though they're protected, it still takes a level of courage to stand up and to exercise those freedoms and to push a government that can feel to citizens as all powerful or very powerful. It takes courage to stand up to one's own government. And in particular, because we know that the government has the ability to actually intrude upon our freedoms, like the freedom of our movement, by making arrests and other things. So freedom is at the heart of our democracy, and courage is at the heart of freedom.
I was talking to someone about this episode just a little bit ago, and they pointed out to me that these kinds of happenings are, when they're so dramatic, they can be critical in drawing attention to the issue and to create a story about what ordinary citizens and civil society leaders can and ought to be doing. What kind of story, Sharon, do you think ought to be told and must be told at this point?
Well, I always think about American history when I think about actions like those that were taken by Bishop Barber yesterday and his colleagues. And we have very strong traditions of faith leaders being a part, maybe even on the cutting edge, of pushing moral questions into public conversations like this. Obviously, one of our biggest examples of that was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so I think it's important to reflect on whether this is the start of a new era of that kind of faith leadership in our country. We have many conservative Americans think that faith should be a bigger part of how we think about government action. In this particular case, it's the proposed budget, the federal budget, and what it would do, the impact that it would have on people who are have the least of these, right? I mean, that might be how a faith leader might put it. And we do know that Reverend Barber, from that conversation that you had with him, is very concerned about the impact that this would have on the most marginalized, the poorest of Americans. He believes actually that the proposed budget and its cuts will have life or death consequences for our country. So I do value his leadership in beginning that conversation for us, because if he's right, those are the kinds of things that Americans should be thinking about when they're thinking about whether their elected representatives are truly representing them in the way in which they would like that to happen.
And Reverend Barber did speak very eloquently about that, and he makes a strong point that the effects that this proposed budget that he's trying to draw attention to are not partisan in nature, are potentially deleterious to a whole range of people. There's research that suggests that there's actually more movement making going on right now, more demonstration and protests going on right now than at a similar point in the previous Trump administration, would suggest to me that that people are standing up, and that examples of this kind of courage are critically important. I have a tough question for you, Sharon. Is our democracy in danger?
Yeah, that is a very important question, and I want to answer it. But I also want to talk about what you said before that, and that is the role of the citizen in a democracy, and that we can all respect, I think, citizens embracing the responsibility of citizenship. And we talk a lot about this at the Kettering Foundation, is that citizens don't just get to vote in a democracy like ours. Their responsibilities of citizenship go well beyond that, and so it's right for us to think about whether or not our elected representatives are truly doing the job that we want them to do in proposed budget making like this, or legislation making, or anything else. And so in that sense, I really respect what it is that Reverend Barber and the other faith leaders were attempting to do yesterday, and that is to demonstrate what citizenship looks like in a democracy. The question that I get now more than any other question is this question from everyday Americans about what can I do? What can I do right now? And many Americans feel that they're powerless in the face of government action. So this is the kind of demonstration of citizenship that can encourage other people to do what they can do. And now, to your question about whether or not our democracy is in danger, I think that we have great reason to worry about the democracy in the United States right now, that there have been attacks on our checks and balances systems. There's been an abdication of a very important constitutional obligation and responsibility of our federal legislative branch. There's been an attack on the independence of our press. There's been an attack on the independence of our judiciary. And there has been unprecedented threat making from our federal government against citizens and democratic institutions. So I think that all of us have reason to be concerned when we see things like that. What gives me hope is that we also have fellow Americans who are willing to stand up and make their views heard. And that, I think, is what Reverend Barber and his colleagues were attempting to do yesterday.
Sharon L. Davies, President and CEO of the Kettering Foundation, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Brad.